Right? All right. Now, you would think that this would have been done a long time ago, but in fact, this is not the way this literature is done at all. I'm going to spend some time on this. Basically, what we're going to demonstrate is that when you do the work this way, you can't produce a result that's consistent with the idea that oil or natural resources, broadly defined fuels, like I was saying.
How do you install democracy?
We're going to come to that.
Perfect segue.
Good.
Good point. Good question. Okay, so before we launch into all the graphs and regression tables that we're going to go through in painful detail, let me talk a little bit about our concepts, how we measure them, and why we measure them the way we do. Generally, I'm going to talk about both the concept validity behind the concepts and also the reliability of the data we employ. So the first obvious question, what is democracy? How do we measure it? This is particularly important given the fact that we push the calendar back all the way to the independence of countries. How can you really decide how democratic a country was, let's say in 1800, in 1815 when it achieved independence? And how can you actually measure, let's say in a continuous way, the changes it experiences in relation to its regime type over time? It's actually a great thing that there's a index called the Polity Index that already exists. It's coded by country experts, and it goes back all the way to the independence of countries. It has an advantage that it's both multidimensional in that it really captures a lot of the different components of democratization, such as the constraints on the executive, how competitive the recruitment of the chief executive is, how competitive elections are, the degree of popular participation in the society. That's one advantage it has. Another advantage is that it's a sliding scale. It actually varies from -10 being the most autocratic to +10 being the most democratic. And it's updated quite regularly and used widely in the comparative politics literature, and particularly in the resource curse literature. The final advantage is that we didn't code it ourselves. It pre-exists us, and so we can't rig the results to really favor whatever hypothesis we would privilege. Let me just say we're not really privileging any hypothesis. We're really adjudicating, again, between the three hypotheses that Professor Haber mentioned. Does oil have a bad effect on democracy? Does it have a good effect on democracy? Or does it have no effect whatsoever? More importantly, though, the variable that we do measure ourselves is resource dependence. And we actually settled on a measure that we could also push back to the beginning of these countries' existence, and a measure that we feel is a pretty valid and reliable measure of resource dependence. And that's the country's actual fiscal reliance on revenue from resources, either oil or minerals. An advantage of this measure is that we can actually go back to countries' archival treasury histories, and we can look at what portion of the coffers, of the public coffers, was actually constituted by oil or mineral revenue. And then we can take a simple ratio, the proportion of total revenues from oil and minerals to the total revenues in the country, including both tax and non-tax revenue. Now, if you're skeptical, you're asking, well, what about publicly owned companies that are owned and operated by the government? How is it that you can get the revenue, the portion of revenue contributed by the resource sector? It turns out, actually, and fortunately for us, that even when countries are even when countries own and operate publicly owned resource sectors, they tax those companies or they get dividends from them in a way that's recorded annually, and that can be measured and compared across countries and across time. And so that is what we painstakingly did. Professor Haber assembled a staff of very talented undergraduates. Actually, Eric Schoen, right here in the audience, is one of our RAs, that help us push back the contribution of revenues from resources all the way back to countries' independence, so that then we can assess the impact that increased resource dependence has on a country's regime type. To go back to regime type really quickly, Professor Haber and I have normalized this measure that I mentioned that goes back from -10 to 10 for every country. on a continuous scale that runs from 0 to 100. That's going to make it very easy to actually interpret these historical data series that we're going to go through. And just to put a little more meat on this polity measure, an example of a highly autocratic regime that scored at 0 would be Zimbabwe under the Mugabe regime, where you see hardly any constraints on Mugabe. He's a pretty unfettered dictator at this point. You see political competition at very low levels, and you see repression of citizens' organization and participation. And you also see less pluralism than you did before, and less political competition between political parties.
Does that sound like your country? Yeah, okay.
Oh, sorry. No,
I think that's exactly
right. Well, hopefully there's constant validity then behind it. Some of the more democratic countries, and there's arguments here actually. Actually, in a class that I taught for you, we talked about consolidated democracy and how to measure that. But broadly, there's agreement that, let's say, the advanced OECD democracies would fall on the opposite end of the spectrum, get coded as 100 on the polity score, at least because they have the formal trappings of democracy, such as veto points on the executive, constraining the executive's behavior, pluralism and healthy political competition between parties, and the protection of citizen rights to both speak freely, organize, participate, etc., etc. Again, people can quibble with the codings, but by and large, there's vast agreement that these polity codings are valid, and they're also highly correlated with other codings in the literature based on political rights and also on dichotomous measures based on just elections. So we feel pretty confident that we've got it right in terms of regime. Okay, now let me actually go through some of these graphs. Professor Haber mentioned that we're looking historically at countries over time going back to independence. I'm going to start out with some major oil producers and then move my way to a major mineral producer, Chile, at the end. We focus on oil producers because if there is going to be a negative effect of resources on regime type, you're going to find it in the oil producers, if not for the fact that the rents from oil tend to be higher because of the ability to get higher profits for oil on the world market. Okay. The first graph is Mexico over time. We start with Mexican independence in 1821 and look the whole way through. On the x-axis, you can actually see two time series moving together. You will see fiscal reliance on oil, that is green, and you will see the polity score that I described, operationalizing Mexico's regime type over time. Again, 100 would be the highest level of democracy and 0 the lowest. What's very interesting about Mexico is that you see increased fiscal reliance on oil revenues, namely due to a boom in the Mexican oil export sector in the mid-1970s, precede Mexico's democratization, that most experts agree has pretty much reached a respectable level of democracy after the year 2000 with Vicente Fox's election. And it's interesting because this is the opposite pattern as that predicted by the resource curse literature. You'd expect Mexico's democratization to actually either stay stagnant or decrease as its fiscal reliance on oil revenues goes up over time. The next graph is Venezuela over time. Again, we can observe it from its independence. And on the x-axis, we see the two series moving together. In orange, you'll see the polity score again, operationalizing regime type, and you'll see fiscal reliance on oil revenues in green. We see the same pattern. Increased fiscal reliance in Venezuela precedes democratization and is then commensurate with democratization in more contemporary periods. In Ecuador, you see increased fiscal reliance and democratization are pretty much coterminous. They occur in sync over time, around the early 70s when Ecuador discovers oil in the Amazon basin and really begins to export it widely. Moving to Africa, in Nigeria, you really don't see the purported negative relationship between increased fiscal reliance on oil and regime type. You'll actually see a transition from democracy to authoritarianism precede increased fiscal reliance on oil, and despite a high level of fiscal reliance on oil around the early mid-'80s.